All right, Nico, can you say, welcome to another episode of Healthy Births, Happy Babies?
It's a happy episode. Happy babies.
Hello and welcome back to Healthy Births, Happy Babies. I am Dr. Jay Warren, the host of this podcast, as well as a prenatal and pediatric chiropractor here in San Diego. And if you're a brand new listener, you won't know this, but welcome. And if you're a regular listener, you know that the podcast has been on hiatus for a little while. I've been very, very busy, as I'm sure many of you are. I've been doing a lot in the dad space. One, personally, with my own son. We switched to homeschooling this year, and so that's been pretty immersive and intensive, but we're getting in the groove of that, and it's going really, really well. But then also I've been creating a lot in the dadhood journey space. I've created courses for new dads. I'm doing groups with new dads, all kinds of stuff supporting kind of the dad spectrum. But I'm happy to be bringing back episodes to you here in Healthy Births, Happy Babies. I've missed it. I've missed having the conversations with the guests that come on. And I'm happy to be bringing this particular topic to you because it's very timely. At the time that I'm recording this, we are deep into the pandemic. Depending on where you are in the country, if you're here in California, at least, we are still in shutdown mode. There's a lot of news going on about changes that are coming about, and hopefully that will lighten the load and bring some resolution to this, or at least some light at the end of the tunnel of this. But the reason why it relates to what we're going to be talking about today is because I'm bringing on Evie Steinhart, who's written a book, Is Home Birth Right for You? And I have had this conversation so many times in the last 9 months since the beginning of the pandemic, because there are increasing concerns of moms and couples birthing in hospitals because of the COVID risks. And so they're looking into birth centers and home births to minimize the exposure for themselves, and maybe it's a safer alternative for their family. And so there's a lot that goes into that discussion. There's a lot that goes into that decision. And the reason why I wanted Evie to come on is she's a registered nurse. She's also a mom of 6. She's had 3 home births and 3 hospital births. So she has clinical experience, she has professional experience in birth, as well as a lot of personal experience having 6 babies. And she was working on this book before the pandemic came about, but it's very timely in that it's answering a lot of the questions that a parent might have looking into what a home birth looks like, the risks, the myths around them, and really deciding and bringing up a lot of questions that a couple might not have even thought about to be able to make an informed decision. So we're going to go over tons and tons of information, and there'll be links, obviously, to get her book if you want to dive in deeper into that. But she really comes from a space of wanting to help. You'll see that right away, that she isn't really coming from a space of you have to do this. It's more of, if this is right for you, it can be a really great choice. And this is how she thinks you can go about to answer the questions that you have to know if it is right for you or not. So we're going to join into that discussion. Again, you can check out all the resources that are on the website, on my own website at drjwarren.com to get more insights on this. You'll see the blog post that'll have the show notes. If you're listening in whatever app you listen to podcasts, the show notes will have links on what we're going to be talking about as well. So with no further ado, let me switch over to my conversation with Evie. All right, Evie, welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for joining us. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you reaching out to me. Congratulations first on your book.
Thank you.
I've done some writing before. I've never had a book out myself, so I can know what a project that can be and what an accomplishment it is. And I'm happy that you reached out to me so we can share like what you've put together as far as like informing on home birth. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Yeah, and your story is really intriguing, especially during this time. I mean, the time we're recording this, we are months and months deep into pandemic world. And I know in my practice in pregnancy, there's been a lot more women interested in home birth, questioning whether or not the hospital is the right environment for them. And this is exactly what your book addresses. So I think it's a great topic to have more parents understand what questions to ask, what they might not have thought about, and how to go about the process to find out about it. But before we go into those kind of answers that would be so helpful, like I think your story of being a mom of 6, you've had 3 hospital births, 3 home births, that's obviously led you here. So tell us the sequence of things and like how this all came about, like starting with the births and your experiences with them, if you are happy to share.
Yeah, sure. Well, it starts back when I was in nursing school and during our mother baby, unit. We went to this birthing center, Elizabeth Seton in New York City. And unfortunately, it's not there anymore. It closed down. But when it was open, it was just amazing to see what natural birth looked like in a birthing center as opposed to the hospital. When we were doing our clinical rotation there, we also got to look at what it looked like at the hospital. And it was just so different in their whole approach, the hospital approach versus the birthing center, which obviously we didn't do a home birth while we were in our nursing rotation, but we were able to see at the birthing center, and it just looked so different to me. And it just made more sense to give women more freedom during labor and have a more natural approach to birth, since it's not actually a medical condition. It's a natural, normal condition that all women, if they are able to, they go through. And I think that it was just amazing to see what women were able to do if they were given the independence during labor to be able to, move around, have freedom of movement. So to me, that made a big impression. And home birth was something that I thought about, but I wasn't, thinking about pregnancy then. I wasn't married yet. And eventually when I did get married, it was just, something that I thought of, with our first baby. My husband was very uncomfortable with the idea of a home birth. He was nervous about it. He didn't think it was safe. And I understood why, since I know that, many people feel that way about home birth, and I didn't want to push him. So I had my baby at the hospital, and I had a midwife. And it actually went really, really well. I felt really lucky that it went so smoothly, especially for our first birth. Not everyone is so lucky. And I had a doula, and she came to my home, and she was really, really amazing. And she recognized the signs, and it was time to go to the hospital. And I got to the hospital, I think it was just 2 hours later, I had my baby. So that was wonderful. Awesome. And one big plus the hospital had, which I really appreciated, was a birthing tub. So that was really nice as well. And then with my second baby, we went to a different hospital because our midwife group wasn't practicing, didn't have privileges at that hospital anymore. That hospital had closed down. So we went to a different hospital, and I didn't love the experience. They had a lot of protocols in place, hospital protocols, where I did have to lie down in bed with a baby monitor, with an EFM, with an electronic fetal monitor. And it wasn't the whole labor, but it was enough time that it was just so uncomfortable when you're having contractions to lie down. And I knew I did not want an epidural. I did not have one with my first, and I did not want to have one with my second either. So, once we went through, I think it was 20 minutes or a half hour, I was able to get up and move around. But the nurses were not so comfortable with me just doing my thing. They didn't love it. And it was just, I didn't feel so supported. My doula was with me, so that was a great blessing.
Was the same doula as the first birth?
The same doula, yeah.
Did you have the same midwife as the first birth?
Different midwife also.
Okay, so different hospital, different setting,
different setting.
different
yeah,
birth team. Okay.
And I mean, thank God everything went well. So, I was grateful for that. But when I was pregnant with my third, I'm like, okay, we're going to do a home birth this time.
Yeah.
And I found a local midwife who was she's a certified nurse midwife. So she
Okay.
has the nursing background, the medical background, and she also had privileges in our local hospital. So, which meant that if I had to go to the hospital, she would come with me and she could take care of me at the hospital as well. So that was really a big plus. And because my husband, of course, had reservations. So she spent 2 hours with us answering all our questions. And we really felt, much more reassured with having a home birth. And so we did it, and it really, really went well. Like, we were really lucky. Thank God it went really, really nicely. And it went really fast too. So she kind of made a comment like, it's a good thing you planned a home birth because it would have been one regardless. So
you wouldn't have made it to the hospital, the birthing center, huh?
Yeah, which is, pretty much. So that worked out well. So
Tell me about what switched with your husband. Was he 100% in? Was he still a little like reticent, or like what shifted with him, would you say?
Well, I think he saw what birth at the hospital was like. And I think he kind of saw what I didn't like about it. And I think our midwife having, just sitting with us and just talking through the different scenarios and, how she would make sure that she was safe. And she also stressed how careful she is, that she, almost not every single birth complication, but a lot of them, you really can see in advance if birth is, if the labor is not going in the right direction, if things are coming up. So she really is careful about transferring early on before things, become more complicated. So, if she has a baby monitor, like she has like a hand Doppler where she can monitor the baby in utero during contractions. So she checks on the baby consistently throughout the labor. So she's able to listen and hear if the baby's heart rate is going down, then she can take that as a sign, okay, it's time to go to the hospital to check this out. And she's just really careful. So her name is Lauren Bildner, shout out. She's great. So she was really, really cautious.
Yeah, I think a lot of the listeners know that like my son was born at home. We did a home birth. And I know for me as the dad, like for years and years with my training prenatally, I wanted to do a home birth. I saw those values, but I also understood it was up to mom, whoever she turned out to be later on in life. And thankfully she was definitely on board. We both were 100% in, but in asking the same questions, kind of like what I'm sure what midwife went over with you was those what ifs, right? There was one thing about the ideal and this is the most natural thing in the world and we want to do it at home, but then also those scary like what ifs of, well, what if something happens? Like, how are we going to get out of the house to the hospital? And we were only 10 minutes away from the hospital, which is relatively close, but 10 minutes in a desperate situation, like could be life or death in my mind, right? And she was very like quick to reassure of one, like her transfer rate was super, super low because like they're checking all the way throughout prenatally to make sure that everything's healthy, ready to go for it to be safe, which made sense. But then also, as you were saying, all the monitoring that's going on, she said, when I do transfers, it's usually like, all right, this isn't going as planned. In the next hour or so, we're going to need to move to the hospital. And there could be emergency situations, of course, but that was really reassuring because I was imagining like a 911 situation of, all right, how are they going to get into the complex and, and all those things? And am I putting my baby and my partner at risk? So I think those things, we can talk more about that later on in the episode, but I just wanted to like add that part in about like, if your partner feels unsafe about it or reticent, like that stress is going to affect the birth, right? So making sure both are on the same page is super important. I applaud your midwife for really spending the time to make sure that your partner was as comfortable as you were.
Yes. Yeah. And she said, she's like, you don't even have to decide now. We can decide later because we can plan to deliver at our local hospital and I can always change it to a home birth, a few weeks before as well. It wasn't like something we had to decide right then and there, because I know a lot of midwives don't. So it's important that, she was able to tell us that, we had that option, that option of not having to decide right then and there. So
That's a
was
really
nice
great
as
option.
well.
Yeah, we didn't have that. Our midwife was a lay midwife, so there wasn't the option of the transfer there. So that was even more so that you can start a process, but like have it changed if you need to. Great. So
Yeah,
I didn't mean to. Sorry.
Well, I was curious how your home birth went.
It was incredible. It was incredible.
Yeah.
I mean, it was the only stress going into it was she was knocking the door of 42 weeks. And in California, you can't go longer than 42 weeks. And so but things came along a couple of days beforehand as they did. It was 7 hours of labor. She's a pretty petite woman, and Nico was 9 pounds when he was born, but she did it like all herself. And we had the midwife, we had a doula, it was myself, a midwife assistant, and I don't have anything to compare it to. Like, I don't have a hospital birth to compare it to, but I just know what a wonderful experience it was. And afterwards, to not have to go anywhere and to just be at home and to have the midwife coming to you every day and then every other day in postpartum care was very different than that. So I am such a big proponent of home birth. I think it's a fantastic thing if it's the right for every parent. And that's why I'm wanting to share your insight and all the interviews that you did around how do we find out, how does a couple go about finding out if it is the right thing and how to explore.
Yes. So yeah, I think it definitely is something for sure. Every, woman who is low risk and has no underlying medical, complications, definitely it's something to look into just to see if, seeing the different, everybody has different options depending on their community and where they live. So,
Right.
But it's definitely worth looking into because it really is pretty safe, and the hospital has its risks as well. So it's that's how I look at it. You're trading in one set of risks for another. So I think it's something that you have to kind of weigh up and see what your options are locally. So.
And is it different? Like here in San Diego, there are tons of amazing midwives to choose from. There are a number of birth centers. I mean, we're a bigger area, obviously, and there's the natural birth community here is very strong. But I would imagine, like, depending on where you are in the country or the world, that might not be as option. Is there a big difference, or is it becoming more popular? What did your research show?
Well, I know in different rural parts of the United States, I think options are pretty limited. Your nearest hospital might be 2 hours away. So then I don't think you'd be able to have a home birth because that's just too much travel time if, things get a little bit more complex.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's really, a possibility. So I guess depending on where you are and, I've read even online, just some people are kind of stuck. They have a hospital nearby, but it's a very high C-section rate, like 50%. And then the local midwife, is illegal. She doesn't have privileges to be able to deliver at home. So then it's kind of a conundrum, and it's hard for people who only have options, who their options are limited. And that's something that they have to kind of just really research and decide for themselves what the best. That's also why I really believe it's important not to judge people for their decisions. It's hard to know, where people are coming from. And that's something that I also experienced myself when I was planning my third home birth. It's that I just felt like when I mentioned the word home birth, people really, really kind of didn't react very well. And I felt very uncomfortable, as if like putting myself at risk and my baby at risk to decide to have a home birth. And I find that with my sixth baby that I just planned now during COVID, people were much more understanding of my decision to have a home birth, even though I had planned it before the pandemic even hit. But I think people are realizing that there are risks involved in going to the hospital as well. So
right, and I don't know in California, or at least in San Diego, like in the hospital now, a lot of doulas are not allowed in the hospitals right now for birth. So you don't have that continuous support, which I think, I mean, we're talking about home birth, but doulas are like an amazing support system that improve birth outcomes. But then also like just the risks of being in a hospital environment triggers a lot for parents that then might think like, oh my gosh, like, am I that afraid of a hospital that I'm going to do this crazy thing of a home birth? But that's like what your book explores about, you know, the safety of things. And really even like what I love too is like the questions to either ask yourself or to the practitioner. So maybe this goes back to like you kind of getting back to like the change from a hospital birth over to the home birth. Like what were the kind of things that you were wanting to be different and wanting in a home birth experience that you didn't have, that might also be coupled with like what your husband was going through?
Yeah. So I knew I wouldn't have anyone telling me what to do, which is nice. You know, when the nurse walks in and says, you have to go lay down in the bed now, I wouldn't have someone doing that. Of course, my midwife, she'll ask me, you know, if she needs to check me, or she'll say, you know, can you please lay down? But it won't be like that loss of control that you have in the hospital where you're basically, you know, you're the patient. You know, at home, you're not a patient. You're a person having a baby and you have people there to support you.
Right.
And that is something that's very different. And then freedom of movement, being able to go into whatever position I need to. Of course, the midwife, sometimes she'll guide me and she'll tell me which, you know, if I need to lay down, she'll ask me, is that okay? Or, but it's not that kind of where you feel that you're at the mercy of the hospital. Feeling obviously at home, and just having that was me. I know for myself, and I'm sure many will. There's something to feeling comfortable in space and being in a setting that you're comfortable in. It just kind of helps move labor along, and research does show that it just labor moves on a little bit more quickly and easily. So that's just something that I wanted to have.
Right. Especially like eating and drinking during labor, you know, like having sustenance and energy to be able to do the task at hand, which isn't available in a hospital setting usually because of the requirements that potentially you could need a C-section. So we're not going to allow you to eat, which then makes you weaker, which might, you know, increase the chances of a C-section happening.
That's right. Yeah, you have a less of a chance. I know that home births have a much lower C-section rate than hospital births because they give labor a chance. I mean, I know in the hospital you're on a clock. Once you're in the hospital, they are carefully monitoring you to see, making sure that you're dilating at a certain pace. And at home you don't have that hanging over your head. Of course, you know, they're checking the baby, making sure the baby's okay, but you do have more time to labor, which is a big deal. That's one of the biggest reasons I have a C-section is because labor isn't progressing. So, and that's something that at home it's more likely to progress well because you are in a more comfortable setting. And I know that the hormonal balance is also important. You don't have the endorphins that are released. Endorphins are released when you're at home, when you're comfortable, when you're feeling in a space of where you're feeling comfortable, as opposed to the hospital where there's catecholamines that can be released when you're uncomfortable, when you're nervous, when you're not sure what's happening. So that can interfere with labor as well.
Yeah, I mean, that stress response is going to slow down labor because you're not in a safe environment. And one, you're able to I think the major point is too, like in a home birth, and as long as everything's like safe and healthy, a labor is allowed to progress as it needs to, rather than being on a time frame and a schedule. And that then just by itself is going to allow it to move quicker, right? Because there isn't a stress response. But if it does take longer, then it's okay, as long as everything's checking out.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. Yes. And as long as everything's going well, there's no reason to, rush it. I mean, some people just take longer. So. Right.
Did you find that each of your labors went quicker as you went along?
At home, it definitely. When I plant the home births, definitely were quicker than the hospital births. I mean, my last baby, the one who was born just now, he was born June 30th during COVID. So he was, my active labor was pretty quick. My water broke early in the morning, like around 4:30. And then during the day, I think I was an early labor, but I was busy doing laundry and running around. I didn't really feel like I was in labor until, later on in the afternoon, evening time. So, and then he was born at like 10:45 at night. So,
Oh, wow.
the active portion was pretty quick.
Right. Nice.
Yeah.
And did you find like the postpartum care experience? I know, like I had mentioned it, like was so different than what I hear of with the patients that I work with now that are in a typical hospital setting. Like that was something that was amazing to have the midwife checking on you the day afterwards. And like, is it the same there? Is that a standard of care in midwifery?
Yes, yeah, they do come by to check on you, which is really nice. They come to your house and they, check on the baby, they check on you, they make sure that you're doing well. And yeah, it's nice. It's really, really nice. Yeah.
Yeah, because that kind of continuity is so important, especially for first-time parents where, I mean, you just don't know what you don't know, right? It's so stressful, but to have,
Yeah.
instead of having to like leave then the hospital and then be home and then like gather everything up and try and get the kiddo out to like see the pediatrician, if you're seeing a pediatrician, or see if everything's okay. Like you have somebody that was with you during your pregnancy, with you during the birth, that's doing the post checks, that is able to say like, this is something you need to go to your pediatrician today about and check, or no, you're doing fine. It's that great kind of portal that allows you to like nurture your new parenthood in a gentler way than kind of being thrown into it.
Yeah, definitely. So that, I mean, also I did have the experience of working in I forgot to mention, I did have the experience of working in a hospital for 2 years back before I had kids. I worked in mother baby floor and postpartum. So I kind of do feel comfortable, also taking care of the baby postpartum, just because that's what I did.
Yeah.
So
right.
yeah. So that was nice. And that also, I forgot to mention, that did also influence me to also want to have a home birth, because I saw what hospital, I got a more in-depth look at what it was like to give birth in the hospital. So, and it was a good hospital that I worked at, but it's just different being home, so.
Right. Well, and to go back to something that you mentioned before, you said that like this last birth that you had at home, because it was during the pandemic, that there was a lot more acceptance of that notion. What are women now, like now that you have your book out and reaching out to you, like what are the kind of questions that are like most stuck in their mind that they need to have answered, you feel that we can talk about right now, so that if a listener right now has those same questions in their mind? I mean, we talked a lot about safety, but was there anything surprising in either conversations you've had or the interviews that came up that you think that our listeners should know about right now?
Sure. So I think that one question that everybody asks about home birth, and that's something that I asked myself every time I planned a home birth, is home birth safe? Am I putting myself at risk? Am I putting my baby at risk by planning a home birth? And I think that there is definitely a lot to talk about over there, because obviously if you give birth in the hospital, you have the OR right there where they could do an emergency C-section if needed. And I think that and I have a whole chapter in my book that I know some people asked me, like, do you really want to put that in there? Why would you want to scare pregnant women? And I have a whole chapter, all the different medical complications that can occur during birth and during labor, and at home and how they are addressed in the hospital, because I think it is a very important question. I think it's important to understand what exactly when we talk about risks, what exactly are the risks. So I cover, exactly what the statistically and what the data shows, how often it occurs, if it's, and if several complications are more likely to occur at a hospital, just because of the interventions, the routine medical interventions that do occur at the hospital that you won't get at a home birth. But of course, there are risks that can occur at home as well. And I do think that it's still, as much as if my birth is 10 minutes, my home is 10 minutes away from the hospital. And I felt like that was, that I felt comfortable with that time. If we did need to move to the hospital, I felt like that was an okay time to have to travel. I know many midwives will only take on a home birth if it's within 30 minutes to the nearest hospital, for that reason, because a real complication that occurs out of nowhere that can occur from 1 second to the next is extremely rare. But you do want to know that you are near enough to the hospital. So because if someone does need to have an emergency C-section, it still takes about 10 minutes till they prep the patient, prep the room, have the OR team set up. It still takes about that much time, even for a real emergency C-section to occur. Home, and the midwife can go ahead and say, this is what's going on. We will need to do emergency C-section, and everything can assemble at the hospital, before the patient gets there. So that is something to keep in mind. And like I said earlier, you're kind of trading in one set of risks for another. So meaning in the hospital, there are risks, first of all, for infection, besides COVID, there's always other infections that are traveling around hospitals that can be transmitted to the patient. And then there is other risks for trauma, psychological trauma. Unfortunately, some hospitals, they do have nurses who are not sensitive. There are doctors who are not sensitive, and people do suffer trauma just psychologically through the birth when there's interventions like where babies are separated from mothers at birth routinely. There are some hospitals that are still doing that. There's other kinds of trauma where patients are not treated right, they're not treated well, and it's kind of, there are risks in both situations. So I think that it's a decision everyone needs to make for themselves and has to think about very carefully.
Right. Well, and that's why I think your book is such a great resource for those exact kind of questions, because yes, that big chapter about risk is important, but as you go through the sequence of things, it spurs a lot of questions that a couple might not have thought about. So I think that is extremely valuable. But then also in exploring the different birth options, then they're armed, I don't want to say armed, but they're informed with the kind of questions to ask to make sure, is this one provider and is this setting the best thing for them? So can you share with us like where you can find out more about your work, share your website, and then also like where they can get your book?
Oh, sure. So if you can look at my book, it's on Amazon. You just type in on Amazon, "Is a home birth right for you?" And then it should come up. It's got a pink cover. And my website is homebirthmom.com, mom with an O. And it has a lot of interviews that I had with different home birth mothers, doulas, birth professionals, researchers, and it has a lot of information. So if you want to read up more on different interviews that I've had, they're actually really, really interesting. And then my book as well, it can be downloaded on Kindle, or you can order it on paperback. And I am also on social media, on Instagram and on Twitter.
But I'll make sure that all those links to the website, to Amazon, to your social media profiles are available in the show notes. So you listening in, make sure you just click right over there. Evie, thank you so much for being here today. I've obviously, as I was saying before, I love home birth. It was an amazing experience for me and my son coming into the world, but thank you for sharing your story here. And it might inspire people to look at it in a different way. If it's the right fit for them, then they can have, I want everyone to have a beautiful birth experience, and that can happen in all kinds of settings. But I think especially in this day and age, and with the pandemic, more people are looking into it. I just want them to have your information to be making informed choices about it. So I appreciate your work, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Hi, it's Dr. J again, and I want to thank you so much for listening to the podcast. It's something I really enjoy doing, and I, as a parent, learn a ton from these experts coming on and sharing their wisdom, so I hope you're getting a lot out of it too. And I want to share something else with you. I've created a guide called the 40 Ways to Connect with Your Baby During Pregnancy. It's full of simple things you can do on a day-to-day basis that'll help strengthen that bond that you have with your baby. It's a free download. You can go to my website at drjwarren.com/40ways and just enter your email. I'll send it right to you. You can download it and start working on it right away. All of the research that I'm learning in the fields of epigenetics and attachment parenting is showing that the more bonded you are during your pregnancy with your baby, the better the birth is going to go, and the better parenting is going to go, because you have that strong foundation, a strong connection to build upon. So go again to my website. It's drjwarren.com/40 ways and get that free guide. And again, thanks for listening.